Welcome to the Ag Culture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life global perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemuller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. Today is a really neat episode. We're talking about the coffee sector. I know there's probably not a lot of people that really know much about it, so I think it'll be very interesting for you. And we're going to talk on this episode with Robby Kuster from Green Coffee Company and the Legacy Group that manages the Green Coffee Company. And it's more about the production side of things, the coffee industry in general. And this interview actually went on for quite a while, so I'm going to make it into a two-part episode. So this is going to be one episode. The next episode we're going to have will be focused on the people side of the business and business structure itself. So I hope you really enjoy this and this deep dive into the coffee business with Robby Kuster. Well, welcome to another episode of Ag Culture Podcast. Today, we have a great guest, Robby Kuster from the Green Coffee Company in Medellin, Colombia. And welcome, Robby, to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
Looking forward to this conversation. Coffee is a very interesting subject, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's get into it. Green Coffee Company. So you're a vice president for Legacy Group, which is actually the management company for Green Coffee Company. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We manage Green Coffee Company on behalf of the investors in the company.
All right. So why don't you go a little bit into Green Coffee Companies, kind of where they're at right now? I mean, there's been a lot of publicity that's been out there, favorable publicity, which is a good thing to have, right? I've seen you guys in the Financial Times, Forbes, and I believe Fortune magazine as well. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. We've had a number of exciting, press releases and features in these publications talking about, the circular economy, how we're sort of changing the coffee industry for the better, and what we're trying to do both for investors and also for the coffee sector at large in Colombia. So the Financial Times did a piece about us related to the circular economy and how we're monetizing parts of the coffee cherry that have not been monetized before. And Forbes also hit on a number of these sustainability themes that are both really exciting for coffee drinkers and end users, but also for investors in terms of how we are bringing new ideas to an industry that hasn't really received investment or a meaningful look in a while. So we were really happy to see these pieces released.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Great accolades to have on your portfolio there. So could you go into a little bit into how Green Coffee Company is structured and how it got started and what it's all about?
Sure. So originally, Green Coffee Company, as it was the founding idea from Cole Shepard, the founder, was there were a number of real estate investors in American real estate investors who were looking for additional exposure to agriculture in Colombia. They had already invested in real estate in Colombia and wanted exposure to agriculture, specifically coffee. So it originally started out as a consolidation play where you were looking at combining a few farms, improving the processing facilities, and basically producing specialty coffee for roasters. What we found as we continued on operating is that there was immense underinvestment in the region, in technology, both at the farm level in terms of what you can in terms of fertilizer and other products and varietals that are used on the farms, as well as the machinery that's used to process the coffee, vertically integrating all the way up to roasting and selling coffee in developed markets. We saw a really significant gap in developing countries there. So what we've realized is, as we've brought in more capital, that there's a great chance to both improve the sector locally, providing formal employment, improved agricultural practices that will help restore the land to how it was before, as well as an ability to generate a lot more profitability by reducing the number of middlemen in the coffee supply chain, and getting coffee traceably, sustainably sourced directly from the farm all the way to the end cup. So that's sort of what this has evolved into. And we've been really excited with the investors that we've had along the way, as they've seen our vision change over time and target this much larger ambition, as we have grown and identified new opportunities.
That's great. So, growing up, I would watch the news as a young kid, and you'd see things coming out of Colombia that weren't very favorable, right? So,
Absolutely.
I thought of Colombia, 5-10 years ago as, oh, that's probably not the safest place in the world. Why is now the right time? Why are people investing in Colombia? What's the difference between now and 10 or 20 years ago?
Sure. I mean, 10 or 20 years ago, you had a lot more political and economic instability. You had a lot more, wider scale problems with drugs that were, and other conflict that was raging throughout South America, that made it really difficult to invest in these regions. However, the past probably 2 decades, you've seen really, both in terms of the political landscape, the legislation that's come out to be more business friendly, as well as a changing coffee sector. Uh, it made it much more advantageous to get into business in South America. So, as an example, in the coffee sector, the National Federation of Coffee Growers in the past required that everyone sell their coffee through them, meaning that there was always going to be a cap on the amount of profits that you could make within the country. You could never export directly yourself. You always had to go through this government group. Um, that, I think, about 10 to 15 years ago, they reduced that requirement, making it much easier for investment, and much more profitable and interesting for outside investors to look at the agriculture sector. A lot of these regions stabilized. The Colombian government in general really gained complete control over a lot of these territories. Again, 10 to 20 years ago. So things have, I would say, actually 20 years ago now, things have really stabilized in a lot of these regions, to the point where, things have been stable, but there haven't been any meaningful investment. So there's really a gap there. The financial legislation around investment and around company rights and shareholder rights have all improved pretty significantly. And so it felt like a great opportunity to enter at this time, when there weren't really large players in a very fragmented space, where we could bring capital and have a meaningful impact on the sector.
All right. And you kind of came on the scene in 2018 yourself. Is that right?
Yes, I was. It was for me. It was rather serendipitous. I had graduated undergrad, from Davidson in North Carolina with an economics degree, thinking of going into investment banking in New York. Had a bunch of internships there, and I originally was going to teach English as a foreign language for 5 months in Colombia. It was something I wanted to do before I started my, in quotes, real career. And I decided that instead of I decided to do this first. And so went down. Programs kept getting delayed to teach English. So I ended up finding another job. I ran into Cole, the founder of GCC, actually in a cafe. Someone knew him and knew I was looking for an opportunity. My background was more in financial modeling, making investor presentations, that sort of thing. And so, again, it was rather a coincidence that I got connected with Cole. And then from there, I have worn a lot of different hats as the business has grown, from sales and marketing to logistics, building out models for selling coffee at good price points. And then more specifically now focused on the financial modeling, the investor presentations, talking to investors as they come out and look at the farms, and decide on investing or not. So for me, it's been a really interesting journey over the over since 2018. I actually took a 2-year break and came back to the U.S. to get my MBA. With a focus on agriculture, I had internships in the wine industry, in private equity that did sustainable agriculture investments. And while I had the chance to stay in the U.S., I decided, continuing to work part time for GCC, the amount of growth that I continued to see, I decided to make the move back to Colombia and continue this grand adventure.
Wow, that's pretty incredible, going from a career path of investment banking to the jungles of Colombia to be on a coffee plantation. So that's pretty cool story.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think that there in Colombia in general, there's tons of opportunity, and really, I was just I was interested and excited by the work that Legacy Group was doing in general, but GCC in particular. And so the tangible nature of, being able to see the coffee plant and see the value that we're creating is way more exciting than sitting behind a desk in New York working for, one of the large banks where you feel very removed from the value that you're creating. So for me, I did have to learn a lot really quick. I speak Spanish, and so I would spend a lot of time with our agronomists, really understanding the process, understanding what we're doing differently. All of that was really important for me to both convey that to investors who may not know that much about coffee, but also to make myself feel good about everything that we're doing.
That's great. Uh, could you walk us through the coffee industry, the supply chain, I guess, from production through to the end consumer? I know there's probably not a lot of people familiar that listen to this podcast with the coffee industry itself. So could you give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure. Yeah, coffee is a very complicated product, way more complicated than people may realize. So coffee starts on the coffee tree, which its origins come from stone fruit. So it's actually closely related to like a peach. Um, so coffee grows in these red cherries. They look like small maraschino cherries. There's 2 beans per cherry. A tree will be planted and takes probably about 2 years to start producing. In Colombia, the harvest happens over over a number of months, and so beans will ripen at different rates. So in Colombia, unlike in Brazil and in Vietnam, you actually need hand pickers to go in and pick the beans that are ripe and leave the ones that are still green on the trees so that they can ripen. So you need to send people through the fields a number of times. These farms are also on very steep mountainsides, so it's not something that can easily be mechanized. Whereas in a country like Brazil, where it's very flat, you can send things similar to what you do with olive trees, where you like whack the tree and get all the olives off. So this is it's a manual process with our pickers going out to pick. The cherry is then brought to the first stage of processing called the wet mill. This is where you depulp the cherry, which means you smush the cherry lightly and get the 2 beans out. The cherry layer is then moved to a separate area. The beans are then moved to fermentation tanks first, and then to dryers where they are dried into what is called parchment. Then at that stage, it's stable, and then it's moved to a dry mill. At the dry mill, that's where this outside layer of that's called parchment is removed. It sort of looks like what you'd think of as like parchment from Egypt, that sort of thing. That's removed, and then the green beans are sorted by size, by density, and by color. In the past, this was all done manually, by people on long trays and long lines. It's now done typically with these 3-dimensional sorters and other mechanized systems, and sorted into many different quality grades. So you'll have your Folgers that typically sources lower grade coffee from Brazil, a lot of defects, things that were damaged, things that were overripe, underripe. And then you'll have your really high-end coffee that can be from specialty varietals or just without defects. Those are your higher end coffees that you'll purchase from your local roaster. And so that at that point, that's green coffee. That's what's traded globally. That's it's the second most traded commodity in the world after oil by weight. So it's all of it's traded around the world. Your roaster, your local roaster or large roaster, will purchase that green coffee and roast it to their specifications. They might mix it with coffee from other regions, and then at that point, that's what you'll receive in bags to brew yourself, or a barista will brew, and that's what you drink. So there are many stages. There are many aspects of each different stage that have their own complications and their own opportunities. But it's yeah, that's a general overview.
And the varieties themselves are really broken into two categories, and I believe you guys focus on the what's called Arabica or Arabica. I'm not exactly sure if I'm saying that right, but is that correct?
Yeah, they're both fine pronunciations. Yeah.
Okay. So Brazil is they grow more of the other type. Is that correct?
Yes, they grow Robusta. So
Robusta. Yep.
Robusta is that's like the base of the tree. So you have the base of the tree is Robusta and Arabica, and then there are thousands of varieties of coffee within those two.
Right.
So Robusta typically can be grown at lower altitudes. It's a bit more easy to be mechanized, but the flavor is a lot more bitter, and it's not as nice for your specialty coffees. Typically, there's been a bit of change in the industry about this, especially with climate change. Robusta, as the name suggests, is a more robust plant and is a bit more resilient to climate change. What's grown traditionally in Colombia and in Latin America is Arabica. Arabica is a much smoother tasting varietal. It is a bit more sensitive and less productive than Robusta, but that's why you'll typically have Arabica trade always at a premium above Robusta because of its higher quality. But we've been looking into ways in which to do things like grafting with Robusta to maintain like the root system of a Robusta tree, but the production of Arabica coffee beans. So there's a lot of research going forward to make sure that these plants stay above the pests and the fungus that affects coffee, but also become more resilient as the weather warms and lower altitudes are not suitable for growing coffee anymore. So those are some of the things we've been facing.
So and that's why you guys are really focusing on the higher elevations, because that's really where Arabica can grow,
Yeah.
not in
Yeah,
the lower.
we have serious mandates not to purchase. The coffee is grown at a lot of different altitudes, and
Yep.
you'll get different quality levels at different altitudes. But we really only purchase farmland that's above 1,500 meters, or probably around that's like 5,000 feet.
Yep.
We'll have portions that are below that, but we won't grow coffee there. Those regions are more susceptible to pests and other issues. But again, we're spending a lot of money on research and development and innovation in this space, and so as we find opportunities, there might be ways for us to plant on those lower levels. But our farms are typically higher than that.
So one thing I want to walk back to a little bit is originally when Green Coffee Company got started, you were talking about it was really just looking at consolidating land holdings and adding value that way. But now it's really, in my view, from what I see from the outside, it's really been focusing more on finding the bottlenecks in that supply chain that you talked about, and really being able to utilize that scale that you now have to invest in infrastructure along the supply chain. You want to talk a little bit more about what you guys are doing in that realm of things?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think so. The vertical integration that we're trying to do is one of the key ways we're adding value. I'd say there's really three key ways we're adding value. One is the vertical integration and going all the way to large scale roasted coffee sales. The second is becoming the largest producer of Arabica coffee in the world. And the third is everything that we're doing with the byproducts from the coffee production that have never been really meaningfully monetized in any way. So to your point about the vertical integration, as I laid out earlier, there are so many steps in the process to grow coffee Your typical small farmer will not, they will grow the coffee and maybe process it one step, but then they will sell it to someone else who processes it a bit more. And then really where the bottleneck is with large importers and exporters, they're these multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies that have most of the control when it comes to selling the coffee worldwide, and that's where a lot of the margin gets hung up in green coffee. On top of that, roasted coffee is another step of the process that there's additional margin to be gained there. So what we're trying to do is, given our scale and given our international team and our international relationships that we've established over the years between Colombia and the U.S., we see a real opportunity to connect the dots there and invest in not only infrastructure at the farm level, which would be the wet mill, but also invest in infrastructure, the dry mill that can make green coffee, and then to establish good relationships with roasters, with large roasters in the U.S., where we can sell roasted coffee in the U.S. What this does is, a big problem that local farmers will face is the commodity price for coffee. They have zero control over. They're entirely at the whims of what some hedge fund that trades billions of bags of coffee at a time, or millions of bags of coffee at a time, what they think the market's going to do, right? And that's no way to run a business. It's extremely difficult for small farmers, and no matter how much these large importers and exporters claim to be doing for the small farmer, it's really difficult for them to provide any sort of price controls for them. So what we're trying to do when we vertically integrate is both preserve that margin at the production level, and then also provide a level of stability for the farmers who we purchase coffee from. 50% of our production, 50% of the coffee that we sell is ours. We also purchase coffee from the farmers around us. We only own these large estates, but there are farmers. 95% of the coffee that's grown in Colombia is on farms that are smaller than 10 acres. So we'll purchase that coffee, and by having a fully controlled supply chain, we can guarantee pricing that's favorable to farmers much better. We can hedge our positioning where we don't have to rely on the green coffee price and what random people think around the world. We can just sell our coffee at profitable price points. This year, for example, the price fell by about 50% for green coffee. That's nothing that we can't control that. So right. Our goal is to move out of that space. So one way is through the roasted coffee. Being the largest producer helps us in scale and in larger clients that we could sell to in the U.S., whether through white labeling or through things like gas stations or other places where they're just trying to move a lot of coffee. For us, with total cost controls, we can sell at lower price points for roasted coffee and still make a lot of money. So for us, even though our quality is very high, we are able to compete with the multinationals in a way that others can't because of our control of all the costs. And then I'll wait to discuss the byproducts. But yeah,
so
I'll stop.
If there's a lot of margin in the import export phase of the supply chain, have you guys gotten pushback from competitors because they see the potential that you can bring to the market to stabilize things, or has that been relatively calm?
I think where we've gotten pushback thus far is, there are the importer and exporter traders, and then there are the national traders within Colombia. We've started to get a bit of pushback from the national traders within Colombia because, all those farmers that we purchase from around us, they used to sell to all these other guys. So we provide much better price points for them, and we provide much better sales terms for them. So we'll give them cash right away as opposed to promising to pay them 90 days from now, right? So we've gotten a bit of pushback from those national players. I will say, international players, they still have not. We're still, in a lot of ways, when it comes to our production, a blip on the map. I think as we continue to grow, people, these large importers and exporters, we sell a lot of our coffee to. Right now, that's where our business, that's where we get to. I imagine as we continue to grow, as we continue to explore these other, the U.S. markets, it's going to become more of an issue. But for now, it's been the large importers and exporters. They have huge clients that they need to sell to, and we have good relationships with them thus far.
All right, good to hear. What technologies have you been employing? I know that, like you were talking about, the wet mill phase has been kind of a historical bottleneck in the industry in Colombia, at least. What have you guys been doing on that front?
Sure. So at the wet mill, in Colombia, what has traditionally been done is farmers will pick all their coffee, which is really hard work during the day on the side of these mountains, and then they will process the coffee themselves, either manually, or if they're a larger farm, they'll use a very water intensive process that sends all of the cherries through one specific depulper. They'll ferment their coffee in these cement tanks. It takes a very long time, and then they'll dry the coffee out on pads for sun drying. They might have a mechanical dryer, but a lot of these mechanical dryers, if you don't run them really effectively, they can over dry the coffee or not dry the coffee sufficiently. So typically, those processes will take about 14 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of coffee.
Hmm.
We have brought that 14 liters down to less than 3 liters of water per kilogram produced through a bunch of different methods. One of the things is people typically move the coffee through water channels. We do everything with conveyor belts. On top of that, in the past, as I mentioned earlier, green coffee is sorted, like the unroasted coffee will be sorted at the dry mill. We actually sort the coffee at the wet mill now. We bought optical sorters to sort the coffee at the wet mill. We also sort the cherries by size, and then send the cherries through different depulpers depending on their size. Typically, if you only have one size depulper, you're going to crush some beans, or you're going to leave them in cherries, and that's going to lower your quality level. So that's one stage. When we ferment the coffee, we use a series of enzymes that speed up the process tremendously. We also use centrifuges to save water and reuse water throughout our supply chain. Throughout the wet mill process. And then in the dryers, we use two different types of dryers. The first to sort of I would think of it as like frying in like a frying pan. Those are these vertical dryers, right, to get the outside layer of moisture. And then you use tumble dryers, which are lower temperature dryers to really get the bean consistently at the correct level of humidity. You need it at about 11% humidity inside the bean. So that's just what we're doing at the wet mill. Our president, Boris Wollner, he's an agro-industrial engineer by trade. So he has been really instrumental in looking at every aspect of the coffee production process and finding out ways to innovate. So that's just at the wet mill. I could talk about what we're doing at the nursery, what we're doing to plant the seeds, what our agronomists are doing at the farm, on the farms, and then every stage of the process, we've been looking to generate additional value.
Yeah, and I know you've done a lot with looking at. I think you brought it up, the byproduct, and me coming from a livestock background, you look at soybean meal or distillers grains or gluten feed. Some of those byproducts in the livestock industry have become more valuable than the actual derivative, or the original crop that it came from. So it's kind of interesting to see that. I think that's been a kind of a black mark on the coffee industry, is so much waste in the process that is just being dumped and actually is a cost to the farmer and through the processing of the coffee cherries. And that's one thing that you guys sound like you've been really working hard on to find a solution for. So what does that look like today?
No, you're 100% correct. We see incredible value in a product that has typically been viewed as waste. So as I've mentioned, coffee comes from a cherry. The outer layer represents about 65% of the total weight of a coffee bean. So, think of the amount, the tonnage of coffee that's moved around the world, double that, and add a little bit, and that's the tonnage of coffee cherries that are not being used for anything of value. Typically, I will say, typically, farmers who are conscious will use it as like a low grade compost,
Mm.
and there are actors trying to turn it into something, but nothing has been really invested in at scale. So what we have identified is, we worked with two universities who did a bunch of studies on, the different chemical components within cherries, and really where we see the ability to generate the most value from these cherries is by producing ethanol and then producing different liquors from the coffee cherry. This can
Because
be
there's probably a
vodka,
lot of sugars
gin,
in those cherries, right?
yes, it has. There are an immense number of sugars. The cherry itself is high in antioxidants. It has a lot of natural fibers. So, in addition to the the alcohol business that we're looking to go into, you can also, the amount of material that we're going to have, you can use it in a whole host of different ways. We got a grant recently for the production of biogas, and using the biomass to produce biogas and biochar. That's another area that we're looking at. But yeah, really where we're focused on, what we're about to make a huge investment in is a distillery to turn the coffee cherries into ethanol, which will then be turned into vodka and other alcoholic products. So it's for us, we see an ability to be very competitive on pricing there as well, because for us, we could just sell the ethanol, and we'd make a ton of money, because for us, that's profitable. That's better than us trying to truck tons and tons of this coffee cherry off to an area to be processed, right? So for us, we'll be able to be competitive either selling ethanol or moving into selling branded products with liquor. So that's an area of the business, like you said. We see tremendous value there. We think in some ways that can be more profitable than the coffee. Maybe 5 years down the line, we end up offshooting the coffee as the selling the coffee as one aspect of the business, and then focus more heavily on the production of these other byproducts. Because for us, it's really, we've been exploring a lot of possibilities, and there's tremendous opportunity. The distillery that we're building can only take coffee from one of the farm groups that we have, because the coffee cherry will go bad very quickly. It's one of the
Right.
reasons why there hasn't been investment in this level already. A lot of people ask, like, well, why has no one else done this? It ferments really quickly. There's no direct way to sell it immediately. There have not been many large scale producers, especially in Colombia, that have had time to think about it. If you're processing all the coffee you have, it all comes at once. You're focused way more on something that's going to actually generate immediate value for you than you are on this potential thing that's going to maybe work way down the line. And you have to process it within 24 hours, or the product becomes completely useless.
Yeah, so that investment needs to happen right basically at the farm level in order to make it work. And like you said, the scale really
Absolutely.
wasn't there until you guys came along in Colombia.
Yeah. So you really need to control it from that level. But yeah, we see as of now the vodka is the most profitable next step. But that will only be one of our facilities. Other facilities are we've looked into selling the product either as animal feed or as you can use it as a food ingredient. It can be used in like cereal bars and other processed foods as a coagulant. So there's all sorts of use cases, and we're talking with different providers into what makes the most sense.
That's great. That's really innovative to be working on all those different fronts at once. So
We're trying. It's been a lot of work, but you really, the team has been amazing, and typically during the harvest we're focused really specifically on producing the coffee, but this has always been going in the background, and it's been something that's it's not something that we're just like dropping on the company right now. This has always been in the back of our minds. Like I said, we've worked with these universities for years, and making sure that we're not, going down a rabbit hole about something that might work. We've been really intentional about these next steps.
Um, what you had mentioned, you're doing some other things on the nursery side of things, or starting at the nursery and in the field itself. What are some of those things that you're doing?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest one for us on the nursery side is if you ever think about going to a place to like a nursery in the U.S. or anywhere else, you'll see a lot of plants that come in plastic bags. Um, the same thing happens at for coffee. The trees are grown in these like plastic bags that resemble garbage bags. Um, what's the problem with that? Well, the first problem obviously is the amount of plastic that's being used. We have 13.8 million trees about on our farms. That's 13.8 million plastic bags that are used once and then discarded. On top of that, plastic really restricts root growth, so the roots cannot really grow outside of this packaging that it's stored in. You need a lot of material. The material that most farmers use as well, or most nurseries are often a separate business. The material they use is not maximized for coffee growth or the nutrients inside. So you'll get coffee trees will grow more slowly. They'll die at higher rates, and then from a labor perspective, it's a manual process to fill all these bags. And then when you go out to a farm, if if your workers are good, they'll take off the bags before they drop them in the ground. That doesn't always happen, but they should take off the bags before they drop them in the ground. But if they're paid, if they are workers that are contracted by the farmer and they're paid by the amount of trees they put in the ground, they could be really rough with the tree. So what are we doing instead across uh, that whole series? The first is the material that we're using is more of a composite mix of local soil and then also additional additives that keep the tree healthy. We're using a machine in partnership with a company called Elipot that uses a biodegradable bag, much less material, and it sends through this machine. So it's not a manual process of packing each individual bag, right? You use this machine that produces, I don't remember how many bags per minute, but a lot of
I
bags.
just saw one of those. The interview I did last week with Walter's Gardens. If you're listening to this today, go back to that episode. They actually just bought that machine and employed it at theirs. So I was talking to him about that in the last episode I just did. So that's pretty cool to see how it goes from the greenhouse industry into what you're doing in Colombia.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that we've been trying to do, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in general. We're trying to bring technologies that are used elsewhere and apply them to the coffee industry, right? So there's the optical sorters that we're using at the farm level. These are optical sorters that are used for blueberries, right? So they were just adapted for coffee. So that's always been a theme for us, right? So these bags, they allow the roots to penetrate the bag and grow outside, which is much better for them. They'll grow much more quickly. It can take 6 to 9 months in a lot of nurseries. Our nursery, which is one of the largest in Colombia, by the way, it will grow. We had 2.5 million trees that we were growing last year. These will grow much quicker. We have a lower death rate, or a higher survival rate of the coffee tree. And then when you bring them out to the farms, workers can carry more of them, and then they are not contracted workers, they're our full-time employees, so they're not going to be incentivized to damage the trees, or to plant as many as possible in a unsustainable way, right? So they'll just, but the benefit of having the Elipot machine is you can just drop the bag in the ground. No plastic is being used in this entire process, and our trees are healthier for it. So,
And the plant still stays together, so it's not a mess.
yes, exactly. So yeah, it's not a mess. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. The last time, every time I go back to the farms, I learn something new. Our head agronomist is really an amazing person. And so one of the things that we're looking into doing is you can grow a legume uh, plant in with the coffee tree when it's a baby, and it can help block some of the harmful sun. Coffee trees when they're young, they really need a lot of shade, so they're grown under netting,
Shade
but
cloth.
even that sometimes can be kind of harmful. Even that can be not sufficient uh, to protect the trees from really harsh sun. So these additional legumes that are planted alongside the cherry that don't, alongside the coffee tree that don't take away nutrients from the coffee tree can help protect the small sapling as it's growing in that early, more susceptible stages. So again, that's some of the stuff we're doing at the farm level itself. I would say, one thing I heard the last time I was, we went out to the farms is a lot of farmers will only fertilize twice a year, and they'll put a lot of fertilizer on those 2 times a year. What happens when farmers do that is if there's a huge rainstorm the day after they put on the fertilizer, it's all going to run off, and it's going to go into local water streams, and it can be really damaging. Um, we fertilize across a series of time frames throughout the year, and we only put the fertilizer on that the specific plants and the specific lots need. So we do soil studies across all of our farmland. So we're minimizing the amount of fertilizer that we're using. This is typically what's put under the umbrella of regenerative agriculture, right? You take much better data measurements. You minimize the amount of inputs you put onto your farmland, and in doing so, you help keep the farm healthier. You lower your costs, and you can make your trees more productive in the long run. So we found that tree the point where we really started scaling up in 2020, we planted a bunch of these trees with these improved farm management practices. These farms are now starting to produce, and the difference between these farms that we planted back in 2020 and what we've seen from the farms that we've just acquired is tremendous, right? So we're really looking forward to this business as it keeps growing. I mean, this is a long-term company, right? This is not
Right. Just like anything in agriculture, you've
just
got
like
to look
anything
at
in
long
agriculture,
term.
right? Yeah. So we're really looking forward to all of the changes we've been implementing and seeing them, no pun intended, seeing them grow and generate value for our workers, for the business, and for our investors.
Yeah. I hope you really got a lot out of this episode with Robby Kuster and the Green Coffee Company and the coffee industry in general. If you found inspiration and learned something new, or simply enjoyed the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media, share your thoughts, and as always, please like and subscribe to our channels on whatever podcast platform you enjoy listening to, and we will see you on the next episode of Ag Culture Podcast. Thank you.